on Canto 3, Chapter 25, which is entitled The Glories of Devotional Service. But before I start getting into the verses, it would be nice to just do a quick recap of where we are. So in the previous chapters, what we heard about is, in the very previous chapter, in chapter 24, we heard about how Kapila is born to Devahuti and Kardama Muni. And we hear about the daughters of Kardama Muni and Devahuti and how they're married off to the great sages as per Brahma's instructions. And after all of that whole episode happens, we see that Kardama Muni, having attempted to renounce from his family life previously already, he actually goes to Kapila Muni, his own son, and takes permission. He takes permission that, look, okay, I've had my wife, I've had my children, I've also given birth to a son, to yourself. Now I've fulfilled all my duties. Now please allow me to retire from family life. And Kapila Muni gives permission to Kardama Muni. And so at the end of the previous chapter, we hear about how Kardama Muni renounces, how he leaves the family, how he starts wandering through the whole world, just focused on his internal meditation on Krishna, on the Supreme Lord, and perfects his life in that way. But then back at home, we find that we're left with Devahuti and Kapila Muni. So just the two personalities left. And what we see at the start of this chapter is that Devahuti actually starts to remember all the instructions that she had heard and received from both Kardama Muni and Brahma. And specifically, let me just share my screen. Specifically, she starts remembering two verses from Lord Brahma. So this is from chapter 24. This is verse 18 and 19. So she's remembering, Lord Brahma then told Devahuti, my dear daughter of Manu, the same personality of Godhead who killed the demon Ketava is now within your womb. He will cut off all the knots of your ignorance and doubt. Then he will travel all over the world. And 19. Your son will be the head of all the perfected souls. He will be approved by the acharyas, expert in disseminating real knowledge. And among the people, he will be celebrated by the name Kapila. As a son of Devahuti, he will increase your fame. So Devahuti is remembering all of this, and especially these two verses. And so then she thinks, okay, I'm left now here with my son Kapila, and I received this wisdom from Brahma around Kapila's position. And so she then starts to speak to Kapila Muni, and she starts to glorify him. She starts to present her unfortunate conditioned nature, and out of our humility, she's presenting this. And then she puts forward a request. And the request is that she's asking Kapila, please remove my ignorance. Please impart transcendental wisdom to me so that I, even though I'm in a female body, I may understand and perfect my life. And so what we see then is Kapila Muni then starts to speak and respond. Internally, we hear read how he first internally just appreciates the question. And then he starts presenting his thoughts, his presentation of the Bhakti Yoga philosophy. And specifically, again, let me just show my screen. What we see is, so we see here in verse 13, which probably covered last week, we hear about how Kapila Muni wants to start imparting knowledge of which is the highest yoga system, that which is the ultimate benefit of the living entity. I.e., Kapila Muni wants to impart transcendental wisdom to Devahuti, that wisdom that can connect Devahuti and through Devahuti, all of us, to the eternal reality that can free us from the temporary duality of the world that we see and experience around us. And so then what we find is that from this moment, so this verse 13, all the way up until the end of Canto 3 practically, we see that Kapila Muni presents something called as Sankhya Yoga philosophy, right? So Sankhya Yoga, literally, if we translate it, it means the constitutional breakdown, right? So it's looking at the world from its constituent components. And yoga naturally comes from the root word yuj. So it's a way to connect to the Supreme by looking at everything around us from its constituent components. And before we get into verses 15, 16, 17, I think it's valuable to acknowledge and understand that sometimes some of us, especially from Indian descent, we may have heard of Kapila Muni many times in different contexts and maybe even heard of his philosophy before, his Sankhya Yoga philosophy. But it's important to know and remember that and understand that there's actually two Kapila Munis that are present in cosmological history. So one Kapila is often called as Devahuti Kapila, which is the Kapila that we hear about in Canto 3. And the other Kapila is actually an atheistic Kapila. So he's very different. Cosmologically, he comes many, many years, centuries, probably tens of thousands of years later. But their philosophy, although it looks very similar, they're actually very distinct and different. The atheistic Kapila Sankhya Yoga philosophy is focused very much on the looking at the understanding of the material elements, so the constituents of material elements, and only material elements, meaning there's no theological aspect, there's no connection to God, there's no spiritual aspect to that understanding. But then Devahuti's Kapila has a presentation of Sankhya Yoga that is described actually as Bhakti Vitana Yogam, right? So it's actually Yogam, which means it's obviously yoga, it's a form of connection. And then Bhakti, as we understand, is devotional service to the Supreme Lord. But then Vitana is an interesting word because you can see it in two ways. In one definition of Vitana, you see that it's a expansion, right? So it's Sankhya Yoga philosophy. It's an expansion of Bhakti Yoga, or it expands Bhakti. And another way to see it is that it's actually covered, right? So Vitana often also can be understood as meaning covered. So this presentation of Kapila's Sankhya Yoga philosophy is actually a covered form of Bhakti Yoga, which is really interesting because as we go through, we see it's a very scientific presentation, a very analytical study of the material nature, but also of the science of self-realization. And what the scientific presentation does, it helps us understand how the material world's composition, the way the material world is created and present and exists, how that is actually designed to facilitate our connection to Krishna, our devotional service. So let us get into the verses. Would anybody like to read the Sanskrit translation in purple of verse 15?
Can we read Prabhuji, please?
Yes.
Text 15. Chetah khalvasya bandhaya mukte chatmano matam guneshu saktam bandhaya ratam vapumsi muktaye.
Translation by Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The stage in which the consciousness of the living entity is attracted by the three modes of material nature is called conditional life. But when that same consciousness is attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one is situated in the consciousness of liberation. Purport. There is a distinction here between Krishna consciousness and Maya consciousness. Guneshu or Maya consciousness involves attachment to the three material modes of nature, under which one works sometime in goodness and knowledge, sometime in passion, and sometime in ignorance. These different qualitative activities with the central attachment for material enjoyment are the cause of one's conditional life. When the same Cheta or consciousness is transferred to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, or when one becomes Krishna conscious, he is on the path of liberation. Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much. So when we get into these three verses, actually, sorry, I should have done this before we start the verse. It's a really nice set of three, and I don't know if it was intentional or it just happened. But it's a really interesting combination of the three verses, because as Kapila Dev starts speaking, we see that the very first thing he gives in his analytical presentation is an understanding of the entrapment of the conditioned soul, right? And okay, of course, we all know that there's a goal, right? We all practice Krishna consciousness, spiritual life, because we understand there's a goal. And what is that goal that we want to achieve? Living out our relationship with Krishna, right? So Jiva Swarupa Krishna Nityadas, we all understand, at least theoretically, that we're all eternal servants of Krishna, and that's our constitutional position. And our practice of devotional service, our practice of spiritual life, our chanting, our reading, our service, everything is aimed at trying to live out that identity of the soul as the servant of Krishna. But how do we get there, right? Without understanding where we're at, we can't map out the path to get to where we need to go. And so when we see presentations of Bhakti Yoga, especially, for example, this Sankhya Yoga section from Kapila Muni, the Bhagavad Gita, which is the song from Krishna to Arjuna, or even the Uddhava Gita, which is a song of Krishna to Uddhava, we see that in these descriptions, in these explanations of the philosophy, of the theology of Krishna consciousness, we see that there's many frameworks that are actually described and presented to map out our spiritual journey, right? And what are the three components that are required for any journey? Well, first, we need to understand where we're at. Second, we need to understand where we want to go, right? The destination. And then the third is mapping out the journey to get there. And so many of us, or maybe all of us, we have a GPS system, right? Most of us probably use GPS on the phone. Most of us probably use GPS in the car if you want to get somewhere. Then what we need to understand is we can put the destination in. We can put the destination into the GPS system, but without giving it our current location, how will the GPS system, no matter how good it is, tell us the path to get there? We need to be able to put the current location in, whether that's putting the address in, whether that's putting just the turning the location, the GPS system on in the phone. Then through that, the GPS system will know how to map out the path, how to map out the journey. And so when we look at these three verses, which is again, I don't know if it was coincidence by devotees who arranged these, or it was intentional, but we see verses 15, 16, 17 start off this Sankhya Yoga presentation of Kapila Muni, talking about the current location of the conditioned soul, the destination that the conditioned soul is trying to get to, i.e., living out its relationship with Krishna, the pure life, and also maps out the path on how to get there. So it's a really beautiful set of three verses that maps out the journey of spiritual life and gives us entrance into all the components that we're practicing, and reminds us of, as I'll kind of come through the verses, the sambandha, the abhidheya, and the prayojana of spiritual life. So when we look at verse 15, as Prabhu Mataji nicely recited, we see there's two parts here. So one is the state in which the consciousness of the living entity is attracted by the three modes of material nature is called conditional life. So it's talking about the state of the conditioned soul. But then also it's giving us the state of the goal of where we want to get to. But when that same consciousness is attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one is situated in the consciousness of liberation. So it's a very beautifully presenting and giving us the current state of the living entity in our pure state and our conditioned state. right? So in the conditioned state, what we see is that we're under the influence of the three modes, right? When in our conditioned state. But in the eternal state, we're no longer conditioned, but instead we're actually in a liberated state. And so when we look at the three modes come up many, many times throughout the Bhagavatam, and obviously the Bhagavad Gita as well. I mean, there's what, chapter 14, chapter 17 of the Bhagavad Gita entirely dedicated to the modes. We see some of chapter 13, some of chapter 18 is also dedicated. So almost like you could say 2.5 chapters are dedicated to the three modes of nature. And the Sanskrit term used here is guneshu, right? Or here, guneshu comes from the term guna. Now, guna has multiple meanings, and one of the meanings of guna is actually rope, right? And what does a rope do? Well, as we understand, especially Damodar Lila, we understand that a rope's position is to bind. And so when we're talking about conditioned nature, it's quite befitting that we talk about the gunas, the three gunas, because it's the three modes of nature that bind the living entity in our conditioned state. And so when we look at the Bhagavad Gita's presentation of Sankhya Yoga, so the first 6 chapters we understand in the Bhagavad Gita are focused on Karma Yoga, so the act of connecting with Krishna through work or through activity. Then we see that the middle 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita are dedicated or predominated by Bhakti Yoga, by the act of loving devotion to Krishna. And then the last 6 chapters we often describe to be Jnana Yoga, or the path to connect with Krishna through knowledge, through wisdom. But when we look at it, then it's also a presentation of Sankhya Yoga, because Sankhya Yoga in essence is a path of wisdom and knowledge. And when we look at the last 6 chapters of the Bhakti Yoga, it's a very strong parallel to how Sankhya Yoga in Kapila Muni starts off, because chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita is entitled The Three Modes of Material Nature. And there we get a description of the three modes, we get an understanding of how the three modes are competing with each other for prominence and dominance in our lives, and how one who's endeavoring on the path of spiritual life, they have to look to transcend the three modes, right? So go even beyond the ignorance, passion, and goodness of the three modes. And the very first verse of chapter 14 in Bhagavad Gita has a specific line, Jnananam Jnanam Uttamam. It's translated as supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge. So Krishna in 14.1, in Bhagavad Gita chapter 14 verse 1, he actually says that, "Oh Arjuna, I want to give you this knowledge which is the best of all knowledge, the supreme wisdom." And then he starts talking about the three modes of nature, right? He says that Bhakti Yoga in chapter 9 we hear is the king of all knowledge. But he comes to chapter 14 and then describes the three modes as being the supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge. Why would that be? Why is direct discussions, direct presentations of Bhakti Yoga not the supreme knowledge? Because the way we can understand that is that it's nice to understand, and it's very valuable to understand what the goal looks like, right? The practice of Bhakti Yoga, what that looks like, which is very nicely delineated in chapter 9 of Bhagavad Gita. But how do we make it real in our life? How do we get from where we are to that stage without understanding what's keeping us from getting there, right? What's keeping us in our conditioned state? And that's what chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita really does. It really describes and gives us a clear understanding of the shackles that keep us in our conditioned situation, right? And once we understand our conditioned state, once we understand the three modes and how they function, once we understand the shackles that are binding us, then we have a better chance of being equipped with the tools and the techniques to then break free. So then we can actually live out the path of devotional service as described in chapter 9 of the Bhagavad Gita. And so what stops us from being free? Well, in the purport, Srila himself describes these different qualitative activities with the central attachment for material enjoyment are the cause of one's conditioned life. What's keeping us in our conditioned life is our attachment for material enjoyment. Because oftentimes, well, not because oftentimes, but many a times, all of us are seekers of happiness, right? That's the constitutional position of the soul. We're always seeking happiness. Anandamaya Bhasat, we're just blissful beings by nature. And since we're always searching for happiness, what ends up happening is that under the influence of the three modes, we start endeavoring for happiness of an external nature under the three modes. In Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, verse 22, it said, Purusha prakritisto hi bhukte prakritijan gunan karanam gunasangosya sadasad yoni janmasu. Translation: the living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets with good and evil among various species. Because of our engagement and our association with the three modes, we develop that attachment to just continue wanting to experience them. Right? Because we keep wanting to experience the joys that are available through the three modes, what we find is that we keep having to experience the conditioned life. And what is that conditioned life? Well, we understand it's birth, death. It's the cycle of birth and death. So because of our attachment to enjoying under the three modes, we develop a desire to continue enjoying in different ways. And then at the end of our life, because that desire hasn't subsided, we're forced to experience the cycle of birth and death again in order to carry out those desires and fulfill those desires. Another thing that's really stood out for me personally is the word cheta. Right? So here, the very first word of the verse is cheta, and cheta is translated as consciousness. Oftentimes when we talk about the three modes and how they bind us, we often think about activities, right? Even in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 14, chapter 17, some of chapter 18, we talk about different activities in the three modes. So for example, you can have from the Bhagavad Gita, we hear about action in the three modes, we hear about faith in the three modes, we hear about food in the three modes, we hear about charity, austerity, all these different things in the three modes. But what's really valuable here is that Srila Prabhupada is making it very clear that it's not about the activity per se that's keeping us bound. It's the jeta, it's the consciousness that's keeping us bound. So the path of spirituality isn't a path where we're giving up material activities, where we're giving up our material duties. It's actually a path where we're giving up the material attachments in the heart associated to those activities. We can still be many of us are probably working or have retired from working because of age or other situations in life. The path of spirituality isn't that we give up our work. The path of spirituality isn't that we give up studying in school about material sciences and material knowledge. The path of spirituality isn't that we give up family life, unprecedented. The path of spiritual life is giving up the attachments that we have in the heart to all of these different material facets in our life. And the way we do that is by connecting everything we're doing back to Krishna. Right? So when we're working, we see that many people work in the world. Most people are working in the world in order to get a paycheck, to pay for the next holiday, to pay for the next big technology investment or desires, the next iPhone, the next Mercedes-Benz, the next Tesla, the upgrade of their house. As devotees, we're working. My spiritual master, His Holiness Gadam Maharaj, very nicely describes and glorifies devotees who are grihastas by calling their home a bhajan kutir, right? He describes that actually the devotees have a bhajan kutir, not a home, not a house, but a place which they perform the devotional service in. And so when we're working as devotees, we're not looking to feed our material desires. We're looking to sustain a bhajan kutir so that we, our family, the sanghas that we invite home, they can all practice devotional life in that space, in that bhajan kutir, and in that way spiritualize the home. Oftentimes we develop skills at work. We can use those skills to serve Krishna in different ways. If you're an IT man, you can help out with IT projects, with websites, with organizing courses online, doing different things, sorting out databases for the temple. If you're working in schools, then you could always help with teaching younger kids Krishna consciousness on the weekends with Krishna Club and all these different things. If you're somebody who's more creative and artistic, then how can you apply those skills to serve Krishna, to serve the devotees? Help paint, help do different things, help create art for the temple and Krishna. So many things that all of our skills can be applied to serve Krishna. What's the difference is that even though we're performing the same activities, what's the consciousness of the activity that we're performing it in? Is it Maya consciousness, right? Whereby it's very much, and we'll find out in the next verse in a bit, where it's very much focused on the I, me, and mine? Or is it Krishna consciousness, where it's focused on expanding Krishna's engagements? And the final thing to really call out here is because I'm often reminded of this whenever we talk about consciousness and Krishna consciousness versus my consciousness. Srila Prabhupada called the society that and the movement that we're all in, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. He didn't call it International Society for Krishna Activities or ISKACT, right? Because the focus for Srila Prabhupada was not on the activities we're performing. The focus for Srila Prabhupada was that we develop the cheta, the consciousness to be Krishna conscious. And in doing so, whatever activities we're doing, we dovetail them by spiritualizing them, or those which aren't spiritualizable, right? Because they're very much just purely on the material platform, or not progressing our soul's journey to Krishna. We give them up. And that naturally happens when our consciousness becomes more and more focused on pleasing Krishna than it is on pleasing our own mind and our own senses. So we come to verse 16, and would you like to read?
I can read.
Thank you, Vanita.
Hare Krishna. Aham mama vimanote kamalokti pirmaleha vitam yada manasuttam adukkam asukham samam. When one is completely cleansed of the impurities of lust and greed, produced from the false identification of the body as I, the bodily possessions, as mine, one's mind becomes purified. In that pure state, he transcends the stage of so-called material happiness and distress. Purport. Kama and Lobha are the symptoms of material existence. Everyone always desires to possess something. It is said here that desire and greed are the products of false identification of oneself with the body. When one becomes free from this contamination, then his mind and consciousness also become freed and attain the original state. Mind, consciousness, and the living entity exist. Whenever we speak of the living entity, this includes the mind and consciousness. The difference between conditional life and liberated life occurs when we purify the mind and the consciousness. When they are purified, one becomes transcendental to material happiness and distress. In the beginning, Lord Kapila has said that perfect yoga enables one to transcend the platform of material distress and happiness. How this can be done is explained here. One has to purify his mind and consciousness. This is being done by the Bhakti Yoga system, as explained in the Narada Pancharatra. One's mind and senses should be purified. Tat paratvena nirmalam. One's senses must be engaged in devotional service to the Lord. That is the process. The mind must have some engagement. One cannot make the mind vacant. Of course, there are some foolish attempts to try to make the mind vacant or void, but that is not possible. The only process that will purify the mind is to engage it in Krishna. The mind must be engaged. If we engage our mind in Krishna, naturally the consciousness becomes fully purified. There is no chance of the entrance of material desire and greed. Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank you, Mataji. So here we very nicely see how what is the source of one's consciousness being material, spiritual, right? So here we see that the source of our Maya consciousness is the false identification of the body as I. Our bodily consciousness is the source of our Maya consciousness, right? Because we misidentify ourselves to be the body. And when we have that misidentification, then we see that we want to enjoy, or we desire enjoyment for the body in so many different ways, when actually we should be desiring the enjoyment for the soul. So where the soul's enjoyment is acts of selfless love with Krishna and Krishna's devotees and Krishna's parts and parcels, right? A source of selfless acts of love. The body's enjoyment is actually acts of lust, where it's always selfishly wanting to experience some sort of joy in the world. And that could be joy for the body itself, or it could be an expanded joy based on family, friends, society, culture, country, and so on and so forth. But what we see is that lust, right, as it's called, that lust is never satisfied. And all of us will have experience of this, where we've endeavored for something material, but it's just never satisfied us in the same way. Because there's three things that can happen. The first is that you endeavor for something which is, in quotes, lustful, or some sort of enjoyment in the world, let's generalize it, and you never get it, right? So you're endeavoring, you really want something in the material world, but you just never get it. So that's one form of frustration that happens from lust. The second form of frustration happens where you're endeavoring for something material, you get it, but then you realize that actually it's not good enough. I thought it would be much better than what it actually turns out to be. So then frustration, you're dissatisfied. And then the third thing that can happen is that you endeavor for it, you get it, it's good enough. You actually feel like, yes, this is the enjoyment that I thought that this would give me. But then it doesn't last. There's a shelf life. There's an expiry date to that enjoyment. And so what that then leads to is, if one doesn't have a, as we call it, a higher taste, right, a spiritual taste, then we end up trying to search for that joy, for that enjoyment in lustful ways again and again, i.e., we want more and more, which means that we become greedy for it, right? We want to experience the results of lust again and again, even though we know that the result is the same every single time, which is that we're going to get frustrated, it's going to be dissatisfying, and ultimately it's never going to be enough for us. Srila Prabhupada often talks about the analogy of chewing the chewed, this idea that people eat chewing gum, right? And why do we, like, from chewing gum, what do we get? We get juice coming, right? So every bite we make, there's juice coming out, and so then that feels refreshing in the mouth. But there comes a point where you've chewed so many times that there's no more juice coming out. But you still keep chewing with the hope, with the expectation, with the thought that this time when I chew, I will get some taste. I will get some juice. And maybe it does come. Maybe a small drop of juice does come. But for the amount of endeavor you've put in for that drop, is it really worth it? And so an intelligent person actually realizes that there's not much joy in these drops of juice. And so they spit out the chewing gum. And bringing it back to point, they stop endeavoring in their material desires and searching for material enjoyment. But instead, they come to the process of purification. Right? Difference between conditioned life and liberated life occurs when we purify the mind and the consciousness. When they are purified, one becomes transcendental to material happiness and distress. Right? So one comes to this point of recognizing that actually material enjoyment is not really a thing that is giving us the enjoyment we really are setting out for, that the enjoyment that we really deserve and are after in life is actually a subpar form of enjoyment. And so one endeavors on the path of purification. And this idea of purification is also really interesting when we look at it conceptually, because if something needs to be purified, it means that inherently there's something of high quality and high value already there, but it's just covered by impurity, right? So the process of purification from a spiritual perspective is really interesting because, and we hear it from Srila Prabhupada all the time in the books, in his lectures, that actually Krishna consciousness, the idea that we are the spirit soul, is natural and inherent within each and every one of us. But because of our conditioned life, it's covered, right? It's like dust covering the mirror, right? Or as from Shikshashtakam we understand, Cheto Darpanamarjanam, right? The process of spiritual life is like a cleansing the mirror of the heart, which is full of so much dust and accumulation of bad habits, of bad activities, impure desires, and so many things. And so love for Krishna, we understand through that purification, the fact that it's a purifying process, we understand that it's actually available within us, right? All of us inherently love Krishna, but because of our lifetimes of associating with the modes of nature, because of our lifetimes of identifying with the body, and lifetimes of desiring temporary enjoyment that's available from material nature, a thick black covering, right? A thick, dirty black covering is on that mirror of the heart. And so as we engage in the purificatory process of Krishna consciousness, we see that layers start to unfold. And at some point, we can see our true reflection in that mirror. We can see that we aren't this body. We can see, not just theoretically, but we can practically experience and and realize that the dualities of the material world are not a part of us. They don't affect us because we are just spirit souls who are connected to Krishna. And so, yes, we're living here, we're living in this world. Yes, we're engaged in all these material activities. And yes, we're experiencing or facing the dualities of the material world. But actually, as Srila Prabhupada says here, when we are purified, one becomes transcendental to the material happiness and distress. When we're purified, even though all these things still exist, even though the freezing cold of London, right, London's winter, and the scorching heat of India's summer still exist around us, because of our ceta, our consciousness functioning from a place which is far above, or many dimensions above and beyond the current consciousness, the current paradigm that our consciousness has, the thoughts and the feelings that we carry, it doesn't affect us. Right? I often like to describe this in a very pictorial form of many of us are probably living in or around London. We may have visited central London or New York or busy cities like this, Mumbai, whatever. And when you're on the ground, when you're in the middle of the city, if you just stand still for a moment, you see there's so much going on around you, right? There's all this noise, there's all the hustle and the bustle, there's this tall skyscrapers, there's all these taxis and cars and traffic jams that have piled up. There's all these pedestrians rushing from one place to another. Everything becomes or seems to be very loud, very big, very, very daunting in one sense. But if at the same time you look at that same city when you're flying in an airplane above the city, right? So you look out of the window, what do you see? What do you hear? You see the same tall skyscrapers that are hundreds of meters tall become as small as matchsticks. You see and look at all the traffic, all of the people, all of the pedestrians, all the horning and the hustle and the bustle, and you barely hear any of it, if at all. Right? It's no longer audible for you. And that's what the purificatory process does for us. Because even though you're looking at the same city, because you're functioning, you're looking at it from a higher perspective, right? From a much higher place. When you're looking down at the city, the dualities of the material world, even though they are all still there and present, they look and feel very, very small in comparison to the goal of and the vision of Krishna. Right? And so how do we purify that consciousness to that elevated state? Right? So what's it here? Here. So Srila Prabhupada says, one's senses must be engaged in devotional service to the Lord. That is the process. So here Prabhupada's talking about one's mind and senses should be purified. And what is that purificatory process? Engaging in devotional service. That is the process. So we may have heard of Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, or summarized in Srila Prabhupada's Nectar of Devotion. There's a very nice verse that is actually a memorization verse for Bhakti Shastri, right? Sarvopadi vinimuktam tatparatvena nirmaram rishikena rishikesha sevanam bhaktiruchyate. So it's translated, so it's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1:112. So it's translated as bhakti or devotional service means engaging all our senses in the service of the Supreme Lord, the Master of the senses. And what happens when we engage our senses in the service of the Lord? Well, it's described that there's two side effects. The first side effect is that we become freed from all our material designations. So all the hats we're wearing become very, very small in our life, right? We still fulfill those hats. We still fulfill the role of a employee, of a father, of a mother, of a sister, of a brother, of a of a son or a daughter. We still fulfill all these designations we have, but we become freed from the attachments to them. And the second thing that happens is that our senses become purified simply by being employed in the service of the Lord. So just by serving the Lord, that path of purification acts in our life, right? So the art of purification is actually an act of spiritualizing our life by connecting ourselves to Krishna at every moment. And that engagement, that connection to Krishna with all of our senses, including the mind, is something that we all aspire for. It's something that a spiritualist is very much focused on and is very much tangible and possible. In Canto 9, and I think I've got the verse up here as well. In Canto 9, in chapter 4, which is entitled Ambarish Maharaj Offended by Durvasa Muni, this is the very first few shlokas of the entrance of Ambarish Maharaj into the Srimad Bhagavatam, or at least in this section. And what is described here is actually the devotional element of Ambarish Maharaj. We understand Ambarish Maharaj is actually the emperor of the entire universe, right? So imagine the weight of the hat, the weight of the designation he's carrying. But in these verses, what we see is how Ambarish Maharaj exemplifies and personifies exactly what Srila Prabhupada is saying here, which is the process of purification when senses must be engaged in devotional service to the Lord. That is the process. We hear about how Ambarish Maharaj engages each and every one of those senses in the service of the Lord. So Maharaj Ambarish always engaged his mind in meditating upon the lotus feet of Krishna. So the first one is mind. His words in describing the glories of the Lord. His hands in cleansing the Lord's temple. And his ears in hearing the words spoken by Krishna or about Krishna. He engaged his eyes in seeing the deity of Krishna, Krishna's temples and Krishna's places like Mathura and Vrindavan. He engaged his sense of touch in touching the bodies of the Lord's devotees. He engaged his sense of smell in smelling the fragrance of tulsi offered to the Lord. And he engaged his tongue in tasting the Lord's prasad. He engaged his legs in walking to the holy places and temples of the Lord. His head in bowing down before the Lord, and all his desires in serving the Lord 24 hours a day. Indeed, Maharaj Ambarish never desired anything for his own sense of gratification. He engaged all his senses in devotional service, in various engagements related to the Lord. This is the way to increase attachment for the Lord and be completely free from all material desires. This last line. This is the way to increase attachment for the Lord and be completely free from all material desires. Isn't that the path of purification that's described? Just go up. The bodily designation, the identification of ourselves to be the body, is the cause of our, if I go up even further, is the cause of our Maya consciousness, as Srila Prabhupada describes. But instead, if we follow the path of Ambarish Maharaj and engage all of our senses in the service of the Lord, then that is the path to purify our consciousness and become Krishna conscious. And that's exactly what Srila Prabhupada is giving us by the way of process. That if we engage our mind in Krishna, naturally the consciousness becomes fully purified and there's no chance of the entrance of material desire and greed. Just that process of engaging our senses in the service of the Lord is purifying and allows us to attain the perfection of the human form of life. Some of us may be thinking, yeah, that's really nice. Ambarish Maharaj is able to do all these things because he's got that taste, he's got that love, he's got that surrender to Krishna. But I'm not at that level. I don't have that level of giving myself to Krishna yet. I'm still trying to make my way there. So what should I do? Well, in Canto 2 of the Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 3, verse 10. It says, Akama sarvakamo va mokshakama udharati tibrena bhakti yogena yajite purusham param. Translation: a person who has broader intelligence, whether he be full of all material desire, without any material desire, or desiring liberation, must by all means worship the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Whole, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Specifically, the phrase Tivrena Bhakti Yogena, literally translated, it means intense devotional service. So regardless of where we are in our spiritual maturity, it doesn't matter what condition we are in. It doesn't matter what situation we're in. We, by hook or by crook, need to try our very best to engage in intense devotional service to the Supreme Lord, and then he will reward us for our efforts. Krishna is often described as somebody who isn't looking at what we offer, but looking at what we're holding behind our backs. There's a very famous pastime in Canto 10 of the Srimad Bhagavatam of the Sudama Brahmana, right? So he was a childhood friend of Krishna who, I mean, without going through the whole story, he had come to Dwarka. And he came to Dwarka. He was a very poor Brahmana at the time that he came. And somehow or another, his wife helped him take a gift. And that gift was a very small pouch of, sometimes it's described to be broken rice, sometimes it's described to be chipped rice or flat rice. So whichever it is, it's this idea of a small pouch of broken or flat rice that is raw, uncooked. And he comes to Dwarka and he's looking at Krishna and seeing how majestic Krishna's palaces are. Krishna's a king at this point in Dwarka, right? But how his palaces are made of the best jewels, the best rubies and diamonds. How even his servants are fully decked out in jewelry. And here comes Sudama with nothing but a small pouch of chipped rice. And he's thinking, how can I offer this to the Lord? How can I offer this to Krishna? Like, what is my offering compared to everything he's got here? But Krishna, being very sly and cheeky at the same time, he goes, oh, Sudama, I see you've brought me something. I see you've brought a gift for me. Let me have it. And Sudama's like, no, it's nothing. It's, there's nothing here. It's just, it's worthless. So don't worry about it. But Krishna's like, no, give it to me. And he snatches it from Sudama's back, like it's hanging on his side. And Krishna snatches it. And he sees that this is everything Sudama had. And Sudama was hiding it because of embarrassment. But Krishna saw that Sudama wanted to give it. And he was leaving nothing behind. Sudama didn't have anything else with him. He didn't have anything else back home. But Krishna took whatever he had. He had two mouthfuls. And in return, he gave so much opulence to Sudama. It's not that we're practicing spiritual life to get opulences from Krishna. But my point here being is that Krishna isn't looking at what we're giving him. Krishna is looking at what we are holding back. And so the point of intense devotional service, or Tivrena Bhakti Yogena, is to give everything we've got to serve Krishna as best as we can. Whatever time we've got, whatever energy we've got, try our very best to engage in Krishna's service. And even if we fall short, Krishna will see. No worries. He's given his all. And so I will reward him accordingly. Okay, conscious of time. So anybody like to read verse 17?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, can I try, please? तदा पुरुष आत्मानं केवलं प्रकृतः परं Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir Animanam Akhanditam. Translation. At that time, the soul can see himself to be transcendental to material existence and always self effulgent, never fragmented, although very minute in size. Purport by Srila Prabhupada ki jai. In the state of pure consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one can see himself as a minute particle, non different from the Supreme Lord. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, the jiva or the individual soul is eternally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. Just as the sun's rays are minute particles of the brilliant constitution of the sun, so a living entity is a minute particle of the Supreme Spirit. The individual soul and the Supreme Lord, are not separated as in material differentiation. The individual soul is a particle from the very beginning. One should not think that because the individual soul is a particle, it is fragmented from the whole spirit. Mayavada philosophy enunciates that the whole spirit exists, but a part of it, which is called the jiva, is entrapped by illusion. This philosophy, however, is unacceptable because spirit cannot be divided like a fragment of matter. That part, the jiva, is eternally a part. As long as the Supreme Spirit exists, his part and parcel also exist. As long as the sun exists, the molecules of the sun's rays also exist. The jiva particle is estimated in the Vedic literature to be 1/10,000th or the size of the upper portion of a hair. It is therefore infinitesimal. The Supreme Spirit is infinite, but the living entity or the individual soul is infinitesimal, although it is not different in quality from the Supreme Spirit. Two words in this verse are to be particularly noted. One is Nirantaram, which means non-different or of the same quality. The individual soul is also expressed here as Animanam. Animanam means infinitesimal. The Supreme Spirit is all pervading, but the very small spirit is the individual soul. Akhanditam means not exactly fragmented, but constitutionally always infinitesimal. No one can separate the molecular parts of the sunshine from the sun. But at the same time, the molecular part of the sunshine is not as expansive as the sun itself. Similarly, the living entity, by his constitutional position, is qualitatively the same as the Supreme Spirit, but he is infinitesimal. Thank you. Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Very much. So this verse, at that time, the soul can see himself to be transcendental to material existence and always self-refulgent, never fragmented, although very minute in size. I'm actually just gonna go to a very nice verse, which is again a parallel to this verse, right? See here in chapter 13. So this section of the Bhagavad Gita, we haven't entered the three modes yet, but what Krishna is describing to Arjuna is actually a description of the field, the knower of the field. So the idea of the body, the idea of the material nature, the idea of who the supreme enjoyer is, and what knowledge means, and things like that. And here we see, is this verse? Yeah. So the living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets. I don't know if this is this one. This one. One second. Here. Verse 32, sorry. Those with the vision of eternity can see that the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. Despite contact with the material body or origin, the soul neither does anything nor is entangled. So you see, it's a very nice parallel to this, whereby it's talking about how when one realizes that they are not the body, when one realizes that they are beyond the body and beyond the three modes, he can see himself to be transcendental to material existence and always self-effulgent, never fragmented, although very minute in size. So there was a very nice parallel to that verse. And realizing that actually the jiva, the jivatma, or the soul, has nothing to do with material nature itself. But instead, actually, what we are is we're an individual soul connected to the Supreme Lord, or the Supreme Spirit, the Supreme Soul. So, of course, we understand from the Bhagavad Gita, from Srila Prabhupada's purports, that as a soul, we're parts and parcels of Krishna, right? So we see that Krishna has two energies. There's a spiritual energy, and then there's a material energy. When we talk about the material energy, what we're talking about is the material nature around us, right? The Maya Shakti. But when we talk about the spiritual energy, it's further divided into two categories. There's the internal energy, which is Krishna, his abode, his expansions. But then there's the marginal energy. And that marginal energy is that spiritual energy of Krishna that is so minute in quantity that it can be influenced by the material energy. And that is where we are. We as the jivas, we fall under the marginal energy. So we're actually spiritual. We're part of Krishna's spiritual energy. But because we're so minute in quantity compared to the Supreme, we have I'm going to call it the opportunity, or the threat, whichever one you want to call it as, but we have the opportunity to be influenced by the modes of nature. And that's where we end up falling in. That's why all of us are here in the material world, whereby by dint of our tendency to be associated with Maya, with material energy, we've become influenced. And even though in quantity we are so minute, in quality we're described to be the same as Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada talks about it here, how one is nirantaram, which means non-different, or of the same quality. Of the same quality as what? Of the Supreme Spirit. But we are infinitesimal, right? So we're very minute in quantity relative to the Supreme Lord. And so here, what we see in this verse is that Kapila Muni is describing to Devahuti that, let me go through, so let me just do this, right? So here, through these three verses, what we see is that Kapila Muni has first described the state of consciousness of the conditioned soul and also the liberated soul. And then he's described the path of how to get from conditioned to spiritual consciousness. And then here in verse 17, he's described what is the vision of a person who is in that spiritual consciousness, who is living that pure life. And that is that he sees himself to be transcendental to material existence. He's self-effulgent, never fragmented, meaning that he's not a broken part of Krishna. We are actually a complete part of Krishna. Complete part meaning we are not Krishna, but we are a part of Krishna that is complete, that is always eternal, that has a relationship with the complete whole, even though we are very minute in size. So here we see that in verse 15, we've called out the sambandha, right? Where are we in our spiritual life, in our conditioned state? What is our relationship to Krishna? Well, actually, in our purified state, we are fully Krishna conscious and fully connected with Krishna. What's the abhidheya, or the practice by which one can attain that goal, that supreme consciousness? The path of purification, which is the path of removing ourselves from the false identification of the body, right? Or of I being the body. And what's the prayojana? What's the end result of somebody who practices that path of purification? Well, they realize their transcendental nature relative to the material energy around us, and they are eternally situated in their constitutional position of being a part of Krishna, which is one in quality, self-effulgent, but minute in quantity. So that's verses 15, 16, 17. I apologize for overrunning.